Vamos a empezar. Empezamos.
We are ready to begin, and we are going to start with our Zoom motto. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Daniel Mack, and I am the program lead for the eradication of violence from Pathfinders. Pathfinders is an organization that is part of a think tank in NYU in New York that is called Center of International Cooperation, and we're extremely happy today to be having this conversation because, in a way, we are trying to build a bridge between two very important sections of our work here in the violence reduction team, which is basically to bring together the major specialists that are working on urban violence in the Peace in Our Cities network, where we are one of the co-facilitator organizations, along with Violence and Inequality Lab of the San Diego University and the Stanley Foundation, that are here with us today. And of course, the other network where we are acting as the secretariat right now, the network coordinator is Fabiana Burena from GENSAC, Gender Equality Network and Small Arms Control, where we are always discussing a gender approach towards armed violence and armed control. But today we have the possibility of bringing these two communities together in this discussion. First of all, I must apologize for my mixture of Portuguese and Spanish, but it's not my fault. As long as the United Nations does not make Portuguese an official language, you will be forced to listening to this low quality Spanish. Without any further delay, I'd like to kick off this discussion with our experts, and I'm going to introduce and let me tell you how happy we are to have Magda Cos, that is the founder of 240 NGO from Mexico. In English, we always say the person who wrote the book, like saying one of the biggest subject matter experts, and Magda is literally the person who wrote the book on illicit arms trafficking in Mexico, which is one of the geographies where this has a great impact on violence. So, Magda is the author of the joint research we are conducting, GENSAC and Peace in Our Cities, and she's going to be presenting the highlights of this investigation that she conducted for us. It was a lot of pleasure. It's always a pleasure and an honor to have Magda with us. After that, we're going to be moving on to other significant subject matter experts that I'm going to introduce shortly, but after that, I'm going to give a more detailed and formal introduction. But after Magda, we will hear Catherine Aguirre, that is the most Brazilian Colombian in the world, I'd say. Catherine is a big expert and she works at Institute Igarapé from Rio de Janeiro. I'm sure that many of you already know her for her outstanding work. And after Catherine, we're going to be listening to our colleague from Madaralize Foundation from Colombia, to Alejandra Vidal and Andrea Munoz. And finally, our last speaker today will be Adam Bear, who's the most Latin American London man in the history of the world. And we're extremely happy to have you all here with us today to discuss this gender approach to armed violence. And I just like to say that it's of course extremely important to have a gender approach to this, and there are certain considerations of gender justice and many things that warrant making this a priority. But we're going to be discussing why it is efficient, why it has significant impacts in reducing armed violence when we use this gender approach, especially to gun control. So we're trying to think of solutions to the problem. From a technical perspective, I'd like to tell everyone that we are extremely lucky to have simultaneously interpreting into English and French today. So I'm sure that at the bottom of your screen you can see an interpretation button, and if you could click there you will be able to choose your language of preference. Please choose the language that you are going to speak throughout the meeting. Even if you speak more than one language or all of three of them, choose one, the one you're going to speak. That's why I've chosen Spanish, and you can go ahead and do the same thing. There's another favor of me to ask. I know it's not always possible, but for those of you that actually can do it, I'd like it if you could turn on your cameras, because in my view, it's better for the speakers and everyone that is participating of having a greater connection, that people are actually engaged and actively participating in the talk. I know that it's not always possible for technical reasons and pandemic reasons that we have unfortunately gotten used to. So after this very brief introduction, I will give the floor to Magda, that is going to be presenting the highlights of her research. And after that, we are going to have a short time for discussion, and at the very end for questions to all of our speakers. So once again, Magda, thank you very much, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you so much to everyone that is here today. Thank you very much to Pathfinders, GENSAC, and Peace in Our Cities. It's been a privilege and an honor to collaborate with you in this research project. And I thank you for the opportunity of addressing this very important topic from an angle that allows us to move forward with the agenda of improving the lives of women and girls and reducing armed violence. In this research project, we address three different topics: how a gender perspective may help reduce armed violence, how we apply this approach to arms control measures, and some good practices that through interviews and other research that was conducted by our colleagues, we have collected from that and may help reduce this urgent matter. And although for a very long time now we've known that armed violence had this gender component, we needed to apply this approach. We knew that violence has more male victims, particularly young men, and those that own licenses to hold guns are 90% men. We already knew that the ones that participate in militia, police, criminal gangs, and all the activities that use guns are mostly men. So, since they are not so present in the statistics, the impact on women was a little bit less visible, as the same for LGBT and other minority groups that are in some situation of vulnerability. We say that there is a disproportionate impact because to this violence adds the issue of pre-existing inequalities, and these pre-existing inequalities are unveiled by a gender perspective. In urban settings, which is basically what we're going to discuss today, urban life creates different pressures such as poverty, marginalization, exclusion, and this lack of access to basic services, disorganized growth, the extreme populational concentration that we know is one of the scenarios towards which we are moving, pose different risk factors for gender violence and particularly for violence against women. And we know that in these scenarios, it's much easier to have a diversion of guns or arms. So, for instance, for women and girls in these situations, when they need to collect timber to cook, collect water to move from one place to another, it's far more complicated when we are in an urban setting that is filled with firearms. One of the main topics that we're trying to address in our research is that armed violence in urban settings has a regressive impact for the enforcement of women's rights. And when women abandon the public scene, that not only harms themselves but the society as a whole, because it's one of the main ways of disintegration of the social mesh. And armed violence draws on this situation in order to gain terrain and become more difficult to fight. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk very briefly about the gender perspective. The gender perspective is not something that we are familiar with the application. It is an analysis tool that allows us to gain a better understanding of the roles, behaviors that are normally attributed to people based on their gender. So these differences between men and women are not determined by biology, and that is why we can change them. These are social constructs, and as such, they can be modified, and applying a gender approach in the creation of public policies and programs allows to identify these inequalities. In this chart, I'm trying to show very simply, with a very small example of the different steps for the application of a gender perspective or a gender approach in the analysis phase. Because in the analysis, we can see how femicides by firearms have increased, and most of these femicides happen when firearms are used in countries with a high rate of firearms crimes. This could be the problem that we're trying to address in designing public policies. We can analyze our objectives. Women need to be in a safe environment. We can analyze their needs and their positions in the relations of powers. What are these relations of powers? That may be relations of subordination as part of household relations compared to other social groups, in this case, male as a group, and we can define policies seeking to address these shortcomings. In this example, I explained that whenever there is a complaint for domestic violence, the authorities and first responders should ask whether a firearm has been involved. And that would be the phase for implementation. In the follow-up, we will get all the stakeholders involved, for instance, in trainings through social networks, first responders, and also those that judge these cases so that they can try these cases with a gender perspective. And in addition to that, to define what the reaction is going to be to seize these firearms that may endanger the life of a woman. Of course, we need more indicators broken down by gender and more measurements of the different impacts. In this regard, a gender approach may prove useful to modify the different social structures, the way these institutions work, along with laws, social practices, and communication. In the case of this study, we are analyzing good practices that help diminish the disproportionate impact on the life of women. However, I'd like to say that including a gender approach in the design of public policies goes beyond the incorporation of women across all different stages, and it requires the analysis of long-term planning, of transformational strategies and social changes that will take into consideration the diversity of women and men, age, race, sexual orientation, among others, and the different conditions that lead to discrimination. Next slide, please. In this chart, we show the relation between the different forms of violence in the urban setting. That is armed violence, gender-based violence, and urban violence. And there are different political, institutional, economical, and social factors that are involved in these relations. As we all know, when there is a presence of firearms, all of these different forms of violence that may be pre existing and maybe due to some structural conditions become far more lethal. In that regard, what you will see in our research is information collected through different interviews and research conducted by our dear colleagues, some of them present there, here today, that also include good practices to address these problems. For instance, from a political perspective, the analysis of gender implications requires us to go a little bit beyond the traditional approach because this includes also gender based assassination, for instance, when there are women candidates. Some of the major strategies for arms control with a gender approach is training law enforcement and military forces. Next slide, please, because they are listed, and of course, we would like to discuss them in more depth after. So, as I said, we could work on improving the indicators, of course, education for cultural transformation and the eradication of gender stereotypes, training and gender awareness across all public officers, but also to all CSOs and all persons that are involved in this work, strengthening complaints because it's also been reported both through the interviews and many of our surveys is that there are certain women groups or vulnerable groups that are not aware of their rights. And first responders and even law enforcement and those that are required to receive a complaint are not familiar with the law or how to intervene. Of course, building networks because we in GENSAC believe that building networks and raising awareness may help amplify the different methods for protection and campaigns. And campaigns meet not only those carried out by CSOs but also lobbying and the building and strengthening of national and local laws to reduce impunity and armed violence. Next slide, please. In terms of political violence, some of the main practices, good practices that we would like to cite is, of course, the strengthening of national laws and international treaties, the Arms Trade Treaty, and also the UN Action Program to fight the illegal trafficking of guns and more transparent transfers. And internally, also the training of law enforcement and military forces and public officers at large, because we believe that this is one of the main actions that may help reduce this type of violence because this is not only a gender training but also a training on the different ways to control firearms. And as I mentioned earlier, strengthening the laws, public investments in basic services, because reducing urban violence that may result in gender violence requires addressing all forms of institutional violence that may act as triggers for firearms violence. In this regard, when we are applying a gender approach, it's very important to know the needs of women and to understand how they carry out their daily lives and if they have access to resources or not. We're going to be sharing these slides after the presentation, but I'd like to refer to these practices briefly which feature, for instance, including women in the different corps that provide services to community, to have more women among first responders, which make facilitate the presentation of violence complaints, and to have better interventions to disrupt armed violence or to address those situations that precede lethal firearms cases. We would like to set up clearer protocols and greater controls for licensing of firearms. As a colleague, Alejandra Otamendi, was saying yesterday, a colleague from Argentina, in Argentina they've made quite a lot of progress in linking domestic violence and household violence with firearms licensing and also with this type of complaints so that there is greater training and greater controls. In now the next field, which is economic violence, I was still in the previous slide, I'm sorry. We are talking about economic violence now, economic and social violence that is related basically to organized crime, but to a lesser extent with theft, gangs, girls living in the streets, ethnic violence. And in this regard, we also need specific public policies to protect all these groups and also monitoring, if possible, real time monitoring. There are many effective observatories to observe firearm crimes, to have different alerts for the prevention of armed violence, and in this regard, it is extremely important to build networks and to guarantee a greater participation of women and other populations, diversity of populations in constructing these safe spaces and developing these public policies. Next slide, please. As for the social sphere, recovering spaces that are free from firearms, in this regard, it's not that women, because of their nature, are more peaceful and have a different vision of this type of spaces. We're talking only about a gender perspective vis-a-vis the feminist movements, because there is a whole agenda for women, peace and security that calls for the reconstruction of the social mesh, mediation of conflict, and creating safer spaces for women. And one of the strategies is disarmament and different campaigns and community organization for the prevention of armed violence. A very important issue in this regard is social reinsertion and different social awareness programs that may have this component of reducing the use of firearms and also transforming these stereotypes and the vision we have of firearms as a method of protection, but also as an object that promotes or empowers men to strengthen their masculinity, looking at the hegemony of men. From a social perspective, one of the most important points is the educational and cultural transformation for the elimination of negative stereotypes that link masculinity to the use of guns. More restrictive laws and making it harder to get a firearm, awareness campaigns, and also school campaigns, and also as part of the different social centers that may also support voluntary development. Next slide, please. One of the good practices also is to try to link this agenda of women, peace, and security with the firearm control agenda. This increases the participation of women and, as I said, promoting this cultural change and fighting these gender stereotypes of this toxic masculinity, awareness and training of public officers and of all the different agents that may actually be involved in acts of armed violence, and creating different ways of community mediation that may help build these safe spaces. To wrap up, so that we can later discuss it together, to reduce firearms violence in urban settings, we not only require addressing the different triggers of violence and the use of firearms, structural such as migration, unemployment, lack of opportunity for the youth, lack of education or information, and of course, impunity and corruption. And according to this gender based approach for public policies of firearms control, we need to get all societies and institutions on board and to understand how it affects women disproportionately. And we need to train politicians and decision makers, citizens for prevention. And particularly, we need to urge our males, both men and children, in order to have them understand the role of firearms in the construction of masculinity so that they can break away with this patriarchal pact that actually hides these forms of violence against women and many other populations that are against this hegemonic masculinity model. We need to include more women in firearms controls and disarmament, not only as a matter of justice, but also because of the proven impact that this work has. They become agents of change in peace building processes and the defense of human rights. A greater participation of women also brings different approaches for minorities and other groups, and it becomes easier to apply these different models and to implement innovative actions for prevention, considering all of these different points of view. We need the capacity of all persons involved in order to build sustainable peace. The mandate of masculinity has a factor of competition and destruction that, when combined with firearms, becomes dangerous for the welfare of persons, and that is why it is indispensable to transform not only the social culture but also as part of the law enforcement corps, as part of the different armies, navies, because we know that many of the members that try to break away with these violence geared social norms face many challenges and are discriminated also within their forces. So we need to change this culture inside these organizations. For the long term, we need to bet on substantive equality rights and to bridge the different gaps between men and women. And we know that this is indispensable for sustainable and inclusive development. We need to move forward with the different goals of SDG 5 of we know that this is indispensable to achieve the other 17 goals, and also SDG 16, which is something that we're going to discuss today as well. So reducing armed violence in urban settings require the joint efforts of humanity as a whole, every country, and we also need every country to assume their responsibility. And we need the engagement of both men and women because this gender approach may actually have a very positive impact. It requires different forms of social interaction, and it requires us to analyze masculinity and the different stereotypes that jeopardizes more than half of the population. And with that, I conclude and I open to questions and comments. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Magda. I would use the only term that I'm going to use in French today. It was a very good amuse-bouche for the research, that it's a very rich research and it has very important elements. You provided a very interesting overview of the work you've carried out. I'd like to reiterate that there is simultaneous interpreting, so for those of you that joined a little bit later, You can actually check the interpretation bottom at the bottom of the screen, and you can listen to these speakers in French and English. Magda, we often talk about how essential it is for women to become engaged in the design of public policies and the implementation of these policies. But this is not enough. This is just a necessary condition, but not sufficient. I found it very interesting when you talked about the importance of reinforcing firearms control laws, because I believe that this is not something specific to Latin America. Most of control laws in every country are mostly written by men and for men. So these are political structures where there is a disproportionate representation of men, and often for those that are military and law enforcement that also have a disproportionate presence of men. So it'd be nice if we could come up with the possibility of writing like a feminist firearm control, or a firearm control law for everyone, not only for the law enforcement, for the military, and for civilians in those cases where it's legal to carry guns, but thinking of society as a whole. And of course, the participation of women in the design of these laws would be prove essential to have a more holistic regard of our societies. Now I'm going to give the floor to Catherine Aguirre. As I said earlier, for those that were a little bit late, as I said, it's the most Brazilian Colombian in the world. She's a researcher from the Ngarapé Institute in Rio, and she's the coordinator of the Amasarut network, which is a very interesting security network. I don't know, Catherine, if we can say that it's a security network with a feminist and a Latin American approach, but I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about that. And I'd like to open up to questions and comments on Magda's presentation, and I'd like to hear your view. Since you've been working in this field for many years now, on this connection between the urban setting and small firearms violence, I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about your insight and your experience in the topic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for having me today. And it is true, we've been working on this for many years now. And I believe that every one of us that works on firearms control are familiar with the fact that over the last few years there's been an identification of the gender issue, and firearms used to be gender blind in a way, and there was actually a killing an opportunity, because I believe that the gender approach was like the missing leg if we want to come up with a truly efficient firearms control policy, because we were excluding different forms of victimization of women and strategies that are related to different mechanisms for conflict resolution and the masculinity and relation with firearms. So, right now, I'd like to talk specifically about how we can structure a comprehensive firearms control strategy, and that will include many urban considerations and Latin American considerations, and how we can start embedding gender as part of these policies, because it fits greatly with this scenario that Mayra has just portrayed. So while they share the presentation, I'd like to talk about our network, which is Amasulo. It is a network of women on security and defense. First of all, it's made up by over 400 women in Latin America. We discuss different security issues, and it was actually created because of the misrepresentation of women in different places for discussion of security issues. We got together to say, yes, there's many of us women discussing these topics. We are experts in the field, and we're going to provide a different regard, not only a gender approach, but also the participation of women in all security and defense issues. That is the Amasur network, as shown here in our presentation. At the very end, you will have our contact details, but you may find us on Twitter, on amasuru.ong. And for every woman that works on these topics, we invite you to join us. There are over 400 women, and we are trying to provide more visibility and offer a platform to work on these security issues, but not only women, women working on security issues. Next slide, please. This presentation is very simple. I'm trying to avoid the topics that Magda has already discussed because, of course, different approaches to gender and violence will lead to some similar points. So, in our first slide, we're going to talk about the context of violence against women, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the myth regarding arms control initiatives at large and how, when we can break those myths, we come up with a recurrent need to include gender approaches. Then we're going to talk about the general framework of arms control and the potential strategies embedding this gender approach. Next slide, please. So, the general overview, the general framework. Well, I'm going to go very quickly over this because Magda has already discussed it. But 54% of homicides are homicides by firearms. There is quite a difference in the number of male victims and female victims. But 55% of women are victims to firearms. That does not mean that they are not associated to different forms of victimization with firearms. These other 55%, we need to consider that these are percentages of direct physical violence, stranglement. Even in that percentage, guns are used to threat and coerce. So even if there is not such a large percentage of killings, firearms are always present in this male chauvinist violence. In these charts, we show the evolution and how the proportion of firearm violence shows that we women are more at risk with the passing of time. That is why I always use these data civica charts because, for instance, in Mexico, the situation of women has become more serious over the last few years, and the number of homicides by firearms has increased in public settings, along with the increase in violence rates, as well as the proportion of firearms in households. So, firearm violence does not only take place in domestic incidents, but also in public settings and in the cities. So that intertwines all the different topics that we're discussing about urban settings and firearms violence, because despite the numbers being different from men, women are not spared, and they are becoming more and more vulnerable to the violence by firearms. Next slide, please. Next, please. With this slide, we're going to start discussing the different myths that sometimes are raised by people that don't believe that firearms control is actually effective. That is due to certain usual and common myths. I'm going to talk about three of them, and they are always present when we try to talk about gender in particular. One of the myths that we need to break away with when we're talking about a firearms control is the myth that having a firearm at home is safer. There is vast documentation, especially in the United States, more work is required in Latin America, that shows the risk of having a firearm. For instance, when a person uses a firearm to avoid a crime, sometimes they are attacked by their own guns. And I'm going to talk about the second. The firearm is not generally useful in dissuading crimes. And when we're talking specifically about violence against women, there is this idea of firearms at the household increases the possibility of a woman dying from an act of domestic violence by 500%. The consequences are always more lethal when there is a firearm at home. So, this myth that it's safer to own a gun when we're talking about violence against women is just the opposite. It's always a risk to have a firearm, and the risk is always higher in those households when there is a firearm. In our next one, we talk about the second myth, which is that the presence of an arm dissuades criminals, and it's been proven that that is not the case. The arm is not a dissuading factor, it does not prevent crime. And for instance, during a burglary, there is the possibility that a person's own gun will be used against them. And in other cases, the firearms did not prevent cases of active shooters, such as schools or shopping malls in the United States. And the third myth is that firearm control does not work. When they say firearm control, our laws don't work because the criminals don't abide by the law, or it only applies to legal licenses, and it's been proven by vast literature, particularly Mexico, Colombia, and the United States, that shows that temporary restrictions to firearms licenses actually work. When econometric studies and statistical studies are carried out, it's been proven that where there were restrictions in place, there was a reduction in violence. Now, talking about the effectiveness, as Daniel said at the very beginning, it's important to start considering whether these interventions, for instance, the ones that Magda was talking about, can be measured, and whether we can actually analyze the effectiveness of these interventions in preventing and reducing violence against women, which is one of the most important issues to start determining the need to have firearms controls, because it actually works to reduce violence. And now we're going to take a deeper dive into gender issues, and in our next slide we show a flyer that was presented last year by the Colombian Corporation Against Mines when we're talking about disarming gender violence. And as we said, this is something that I consider to be relatively new. And I like to reinforce this idea that reducing gender violence is not a trend, it's a need. Because gender, it's like, well, now it's a mandatory component in every single project, and we need to talk about gender. What I'm trying to show is that the gender approach was the missing leg to have effective firearms control. And we're going to move on to discussing why. And it's a need and an opportunity. I'd like to show that this is already present. I've been feeling it for several years now, and it's been driven by different strategies such as GENSAC that got a lot of people to talk and discuss these topics. So, the opportunity and need to include a gender approach needs to consider this differential approach, as we said at the very beginning. Despite the proportion in which women are affected by the use of firearms and violence at large, and how gender must be included as part of the general framework when we're talking about firearms control. Next slide, please. Another one, please. In this regard, I'd like to show you a very simple chart of how I see a comprehensive firearms control strategy and how each of these pieces may actually be linked to gender issues. First of all, we begin by considering that 90% of arms come from a legal industry, a regulated industry. That is why I always say, besides household made firearms, so based on the transfer of guns and firearms to the different states, there are a series of instruments that were developed over time, and it's one of the great strengths in in arms control strategies. There are action plans, there are arms trade treaties, there are international instruments for tracking arms, and there are several strategies. Then, when arms get to a certain state, there are different needs to regulate, for instance, private security firms and also law enforcement, so that they can maintain their arsenals fully protected, so that they are not liable to theft and other types of crimes, particularly in Latin America, so that these arms don't leak to the illegal markets. Now, when firearms get to the hands of civilians, there are different strategies for arms control. I'm going to focus on two. One is reducing the demand of firearms through campaigns and different strategies that must be implemented so that people don't have access to firearms. We need to explain that people have access to firearms right now, and we need to reduce that. And then we need to reduce the availability. We need to reduce the supply of firearms through licensing and permits. In every one of these issues, I think there is a possibility to include the issue of arms control. In, Internally, as Magda was saying, we need to integrate the different agenda, the agenda of peace and security and women with the agenda of international treaties on arms control. We've seen that the International Treaty on Arms Trade introduces the issue of violence, urban violence, as a risk for exports, and also the increased participation of women in these diplomatic spaces and these discussion fora, because women were traditionally shut out of these different spaces, and there's been a greater and greater participation of women in this case. And one of these super critical cases that show the importance of the participation of women in disarmament processes show that the participation of women is actually a strength that goes on to guarantee the stability of these agreements. Now, I'm going to talk about the two different issues of supply and demand of firearms. And in connection with supply, I'm going to address a couple of topics that Magda has already raised that have to do with transforming the way awareness campaigns are traditionally carried out, because the absence of the gender issues in awareness campaigns, for instance, emphasizing that not having a firearm is always better, but this is a very naive view that somehow excludes this idea of masculinity and the culture of arms. And there was this phrase of the United Nations Secretary General that says that ownership and the use of guns are strictly related to specific expressions of masculinity related to control, power, domination, and strength. How the firearm is associated to this idea of a strong man that defends their own family. So this needs to be made a part of the awareness campaigns, considering the different conflict resolution mechanisms from a feminine perspective in developing voluntary disarmament strategies. This needs to become a clear and loud message in every awareness campaign. In addition to that, we need to consider everything that we can do in terms of introducing the issue of gender, for instance, in terms of access restrictions. Next slide, please. In Latin America, there are different examples of good practices, some of them already mentioned by Magda, which is, for instance, reducing the availability of guns for those that have a background of gender violence. There was a colleague of Argentina yesterday that was talking about how important this is in the region and how it's been adopted by different countries throughout the region to have different penalties and sanctions, particularly for those convicted or charged with domestic violence. And Argentina seems to be one of the countries that has a very strong agenda in this regard. And there is a very strong citizen participation process. Everyone that has a firearm or that applies for a firearm is part of a public list, and everyone can raise objections. And as Magda was explaining, someone shared it in a chat that has to do with the different spaces created by GENSAC, for instance. GENSAC has created different formats where we're always talking about these issues, and this colleague was talking yesterday about introducing the gender approach as a mandatory component in firearms licensing exams. And of course, we need to use all the literature available on violence against women. All of that can be used along with the information on perpetrators and firearms licenses to analyze who could have a problematic use of these firearms and prevent not only gender based and domestic violence, but all forms of violence. Next slide, please. And also developing protocols and different procedures for complaint processing and risk evaluation in cases of domestic violence. In the next slide, you will see what I've just mentioned about data and research and protocols. So, to wrap up, this is basically what I wanted to discuss. There is a need because there is a differential victimization of women. But that's not all. Considering that is a very powerful element to develop firearms strategies that had become stagnated in time. And of course, what we need to do is to include this as part of that. And finally, to wrap up, I have this phrase that I consider to be extremely important, which is including the gender approach in firearms, should not only be seen as a need or a trend, but as an opportunity. Here are my contact details, and please visit the Amarazu Network website and become linked to other women interested in the topic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. This was truly an outstanding lecture on firearms control and the topics at hand. I see time running by, so we are moving from one Colombian to two Colombians now, from Cali, in the same region of the world. I was just about to say that because it's like the sub regional area where there is a greater presence in the pizza in our cities network, because in addition to Cali, which is a very important member of our network, there's also Palmira that is located close to Cali and has been doing significant work in reducing armed violence with our colleagues from peace in our cities. But I'd like to move to Alejandra Vidal and Andrea Munoz that work for the Alvararice Foundation, that is also a member of Peace in Our Cities, and they've been doing outstanding work in this field. And they've had a very strong impact locally in real life, because this discussion often takes place at a higher level where we're discussing policy and papers and talking about the United Nations, but this is also useful if it helps the field work and has a true impact in reducing violence. So, Alejandra and Andrea, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much for joining us today, and the floor is yours. I think you're muted. I do it all the time. I mean, 2 years into the pandemic, and I'm still doing it. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm here with Andrea, and we are going to be sharing our experience in Abriendo Caminos, Opening Pathways, which is a program geared to reducing youth violence and strengthening a peace culture along territories. The foundation started working with the Cure Violence model back in 2017 with very strong work from 2018 to 2020 in two territories. And right now we have a presence in 40 different territories or neighborhoods of the city of Cali. And in addition to these neighborhoods, are you going to be sharing my slides? Because I sent some slides. In addition to these neighborhoods, we currently have a presence in Palmira and Buenaventura, each of them with different specific characteristics related to their own context. In these two cities, we've been working since July last year. Next slide, please. The adapted model has four components to it that are in line with reducing violence and particularly armed violence, which is what we see most often in our territories. Our model is based on a community approach from a public health perspective that says that violence is learned by a stimulus of the context, the family context, the neighborhood context, the school context. It's also culturally valued, and from that perspective, the affected community itself can actually transform their own reality in order to disrupt this learning, to transform themselves, and to adopt the practice of far more elaborate coexistence practices, specifically for changing social norms that are closely related to the myth that Catherine just mentioned. Transforming the behavior of people that are involved in these dynamics of violence. In this case, most of them are male youth. We work with women and men from 14 to 35 years old, but most of our population is between 16 and 25 years old. These are youth, some of them belonging to gangs. And in Colombia, there is some specific perspective to these gangs because it's not necessarily organized crimes, as is the case in Central America, for instance, with the gangs that are part of organized or criminal organizations. But some of these groups are characterized by being out of school, living in context of high level of poverty, not only economic poverty but cultural poverty as well, scarce participation or low appropriation of the city as such, very low levels of social inclusion, generally speaking, with risk practices closely related to this idea of traditional toxic masculinity that has different nuances, but they all have to do with this masculine role based on power, domination, and force as a representative element of what it means to be a man. However, there's also a percentage of women that are also involved in these dynamics of violence. It was a little bit lower in between 2016 and 2017 or 18, there was a lower participation of women. It was approximately 10 to 12% back then, and right now we see percentages ranging from 25 to 30%, varying from neighborhood to neighborhood. In the case of Buenaventura and Palmira, it's mostly men, but in the case of Cali, we see a higher incidence of women, particularly there are some neighborhoods where there are some gangs made up only of men, but there are some other specific cases where there are gangs that are solely made up of women. And I'd like to point this out to show how the influence of violence has permeated not only the practices of males but also of women, although women tend to resist these violent practices a little bit more. What is the objective, or what are the goals of Abriendo Caminos? There are four components to it. As I said, it's a community based model, and the persons in charge of implementing almost 90% of the actions of the model are social leaders, men and women with a long track record in working for a peaceful coexistence in their communities. And they are not necessarily part of a certain organization or some formal participation spaces. Sometimes they are just persons that have been positive role models, particularly for men and women that are involved in dynamics of violence. There is very important work carried out by this model because interrupting the violence and acting as mediation and this exercise of transforming this violent culture must be appropriated by the community as such. That is why we try to train the team, because this team of male and female leaders need to be strengthened in order to strengthen the network. We need other persons to support their work as well. All of these has been done by interrupting acts of violence, breaking the chains of violence, and mediating in conflicts. Mediating in conflicts from a restorative perspective, seeking the remediation of the harm that's been caused. And that not necessarily takes the place of a formal mediation process where everyone involved in the conflict sits at a table. Sometimes the social leader just acts as a bridge to guarantee a communication that is not necessarily direct but that allows to de-escalate violence and remediate the harm that's being caused. This is a community training process that seeks to transform the social norms and provide different tools to transform these social norms in order to signify this valorization of violence and to strengthen the skills that will actually promote peaceful cohabitation. We address the different cultural and social factors that lead people to solve their conflicts violently, and this also has to do with the work preventing what must not be done and to try to analyze what is the desirable behavior or the desirable skill, and we work on that through different training and education efforts. Although the target population are male and female that are involved in dynamics of violence, this community education tries to bring together their families as well, because as we said, there are children that are involved or youth, 14-year-old, and they're caretakers, their partners. In most cases, there are female partners because most of the people that are involved in domestic violence dynamics are men. And some individual support provided to these young men and women in reducing the risk, seeking to increase the social inclusion levels and to facilitate this transition from the illegality to legality or from violence to coexistence. But as we said, in this case, there is individual support seeking to strengthen different aspects that will facilitate the attainment of personal goals that these young men and women have, because most of them want to have a formal employment but they face different access barriers. So we talk with them and we discuss the different motivations of coming back to school. We talk on changing habits. We don't speak directly of do not use guns. We don't send that message because we don't want to endanger these social leaders that are working on interrupting violence, but we work on the reduction of certain habits such as drug and alcohol consumption, change of habits if they are spending most of their times in the streets, making a healthy use of their free time, and we try to mediate in different situations that they face that are violent situations, and we start working on each specific case. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, we are present in Cali, in Palmira, in different cities of the Cauca Valley in Colombia, and we have specific information on Cali. We don't have so much information, so many numbers about the rest of the cities due to some recording difficulties, but we know that in Cali over the last 5 years, the larger number of murders, the vast number of murders, were by firearms. And most of the victims were male, although there is also a significant number of women that were murdered. There is under registration of femicides, that is why we talk only about homicides, but we know that the 700 and something of women that were killed over the last 5 years, many of them should have been by domestic violence. However, as part of our work based on this gender approach, next slide please, there are different findings here that are closely related to everything that Magda and Catherine have already brought up. This team training approach has to do with denaturalizing gender violence. We've faced different barriers. For instance, the teams will say we are not going to cope with domestic violence or gender-based violence because that may actually create a risk, particularly when the one disrupting violence is a male. Women are 32% of the members of our team, a team of 85 people for now, and women are a little bit more inclined to respond to these domestic violence cases. But with male, we're trying to work on that because they believe that they are at a greater risk because they will always assume that we are the lover of the woman that we're trying to defend. In many of the cases where we mediated or interrupted a cycle of violence, although youngsters bear arms, there is easy access to firearms because with the social uprising, for instance in Cali, we are filled with firearms, and in Venturas, arms are readily available because there is a strong presence of armed groups. Violence against women generally entails beating up women or using some knives, But when there is use of firearms, it's just as Catherine said, it generally results in a homicide. Well, actually, a femicide. She stands corrected. There is also a strong relation, often emphasized, between men and women. I mentioned that 32% of our teams of social leaders are women, although men tend to show their masculinity through force, threat, bearing arms. When the person supporting them is a woman, that situation becomes very meaningful to them because they have this motherly figure that they often say they lacked when growing up, someone that actually loved them and that is key for them along the process when they are inquired about what was most significant, what helped them the most throughout the change. They always cite this relationship with women. This is also being chauvinist, right? But we are caretakers, we are protective, and they always cite this relationship. On the one hand, they uh, have a situation of violence with their own partners, but they are hoping for that motherly figure that they lacked. Now, in terms of the change of behavior, we provide a general approach to violence because we have this framework where there are different causes that are sometimes associated to revenge that are not associated to gender. And there are some others that are actually gender related and more supported in this traditional idea of masculinity. That same figure of masculinity is projected to men and teenagers and leads them to assume practices of risk, drug consumption, and to become part of gangs or violence groups, and to consume psychoactive substances. There is a difference in the age where they have first experimented with these substances between men and women. And there's also work in terms of empowering women. I was saying that there are very few women, but these women, when they want to transform their lives, we are generally talking about children below or under 14. They are often required to transform firearms or to transport firearms or to transport drugs. So they are used as instruments. They are used to call someone they want to murder, for instance. And through that relationship between men and women, they are pulled into these dynamics of violence so that they can actually cross these invisible borders. In terms of creating a culture of peace and transforming social practices, as I said, we work with families, we work with the neighbors where these groups operate, particularly addressing these youth that are parts of gangs. And in that regard, we try to promote a gender equality culture more based on the method than on the content. We try to give a stronger role to women. We try to make sure that they become engaged in their community lives. And in this regard, there is something to say because women are the ones that respond better when they are called to be a part of community activities. I'm going to give the floor to Andrea to supplement this because Andrea is working directly in the territories with these male and female social leaders. Good morning. I just have a couple of comments because we are running out of time. And I like to comment on what Alejandra was saying. I work on psychosocial coordination in some territories in Cali, particularly in Community 20 in different territories, and some territories of Commune 15 in the east of Cali. I'd like to point out a couple of things regarding what Alejandra was just saying. Basically, that the participation of women as disruptors of violence is key, actually. There are both men and women in our team, but women, as Alejandra was explaining, must necessarily be involved, particularly if we consider how they need to be part of these arms control policies as well. Now, in terms of mediations, we've worked with different forms of conflict, and most of the mediations relate to cases of domestic violence or gender based violence. And when there are these type of cases, these male leaders are usually reluctant to take part. There is a different context in each city. Cali is different when we start uh, working with gender-based violence cases. For instance, if someone is a victim of violence and I'm trying to plan an intervention, it's completely different from what happens in the East when many of the places from the community are reluctant to intervene because there's retaliation against those that take action or even against the victims. So, one of the main challenges of our project that we have identified has been the need for our teams to find a better way of approaching these gender based violence cases and how to plan an intervention so that it will not present a risk to people's lives. At the community level, one of the strengths of our project has to do with the transformation of social norms because there are many norms that actually promote gender violence in their daily lives for the youngsters in the neighborhoods where we work. And these social norms are validated through the use of arms and actually reflect this idea of violent males that have control and can actually use guns to show that they are male and that they have power in a context of violence. So, from a community perspective, it's extremely important to work on denaturalizing violence, particularly gender based violence. Many women that are involved in community activities and mediation processes are the ones that have the better outcomes. In Sinome, certain groups of women have become organized and they are generally mothers of youngsters that are involved in dynamics of violence and become involved in peacemaking processes. So they take some time to think of how they can reach an agreement between two rival gangs or two rival groups. I would also like to comment on the disproportionate impact of armed violence and violence in communities. As I was saying, this is very important because, in a way, there is a differential impact on men and women. And this is what we've seen in the process with Abriendo Caminos in the different territories. In some cases, we have women that are the partner or the daughters of a violent man and they become engaged in their dynamics of violence. And they usually get caught up in these short-term dynamics, and this is perpetrated by motherhood because, like, my husband is part of this gang and I need to have children, I need to bear children because my husband will likely be killed and my children will grow up to be part of the gang. So there is a violence passes from generation to generation. That is the so it is a public health issue. In terms of the woman used as a war mutiny, this is also a problem we face in some of our communities because sometimes the partners of those youngsters that are part of gangs are seen as a potential victim in order to take revenge against these men. And they are used like to set score. And it is important to note this as well. From a gender perspective, if we focus on the situation of women, I also think it necessary to analyze the specific problems of LGTBY, um, um, because it's also related to gender violence, not only against women, but also the different forms of gender expression when it comes to violence against different minority groups. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Alejandra. Oh, we did something that was extremely Latin American, which was to start late, and we're going to finish late, and I would like to apologize for that. And thank you so much to our interpreters and translators for their flexibility. Because last but not least, we have Handem Bear that is going to speak about. Well, he's going to speak very shortly, so it will be like some sort of a series of tweets on Zoom. But Adam is a visiting fellow at the Latin American and Busy Visiting Center at the London School of Economics. Adam, go ahead. Hello, Daniel. Hello. Oh, I was listening to the simultaneous interpreting here. I hope there will be no problem with different crossing. I know that I just need to tweet very quickly, as Daniel has just said. I'm going to try to be as short as possible. So a couple of minutes. I don't know if we will have time for a Q&A after that because it's usually the most important part of it all. But just a couple of minutes. I had prepared 10 minutes, but I'm going to narrow it down. Thank you so much for the invitation. Let's cut through a chase. I've been working on masculinity and gangs for 10 years, so I am a scholar, and anyone here in the group can reach out to me if they want to discuss any such topics of masculinity in particular. My door is open to every one of you. I live in Guatemala, in Central America, and I'm extremely willing to collaborate with any one of you for whatever you may need me. I'm not going to present the general scholastic overview of masculinity that I had thought of. I'm going to mention just 4 points that I think may prove useful. The first of them is to think of the different interventions that I've done in Medellin, Belize, and Trinidad that I've learned from. First of all, when we start talking about gender and masculinity, in Belize, we realized that first we needed to work with the vulnerability of these young men before we start talking about gender and violent masculinity. I'm sure that you've had your own experiences as well. Our kids were hungry, so we had to serve them breakfast before we taught them the workshops. Sometimes we need to rethink our approaches before we can actually convey a gender message. It's extremely hard to work on masculinity. If we look at the different participants here, those that are not presenters and organizers, there's only two or three male. So this is the main challenge in these spaces. We need to think it further, how we can encourage men to participate in these spaces. Second, I loved the presentation on the introduction of violence. And what I wanted to do second is we've learned a lot from the work of feminists and gender champions of how to embed the issue of women in the agenda regarding masculinity. And I've been working on this for 10 years now. And it's only over the last 10 a few months that we're starting to hear this. So how can we include masculinities as part of the agenda? Because the people that are more violent because of the percentages and the statistics are men. So we need to use this feminist work to apply that to masculinity and to different interventions with youngsters in situation of vulnerability and those involved with gangs and organized crimes. Three, we need to bring up the issue of gender as part of our communities. We know that women are victims of violence, but we also know that they are parts of gangs. Probably they are not the ones pulling the trigger, but they have other roles. So when we approach these vulnerable communities, what are the masculine vulnerabilities of young male and what are the feminine vulnerabilities of young females, and how do we address this issue of complex gangs, because although there are women, they often have different roles. So how do we cater our approaches, breaking down the intervention, addressing them to men and women? The third or fourth point, I don't know, but this is the last one, and after that, I'm going to give the floor back to you. This type of space and the first presentation Magda did, and the organization by Peace in Our Cities and GENSAC is extremely important. As I said, I've been talking about this research for many years now, trying to link this issue of masculinities to this intervention, and it's starting to bear fruit. But this fora is extremely important because academic research seldom gets to the people that are actually making a difference in the field. And that is why I would like to encourage Peace in Our Cities, GenSac, and all the practitioners that are working in the field to reach out to scholars such as ourselves, because I don't have all the answers and you don't have all the answers, but probably together we can come up with more fruitful interventions. I'm just about to set out to El Salvador to work with Unidea and Gender, which are different organizations, and we're trying to embed the gender issue, linking it to arms control. And we're collaborating with the different institutional authorities, and we are beginning to include the issue of gender. That is why it's so important that we link that to every institution and make it part of the agenda of different institutions. So Peace in Our Cities, GenSac, the United Nations need to take the lead on that. And just be aware of that. We're working on it. We are doing it. And this is part of the work that you've all carried out. And only in that way have we been able to include that in the agenda. I have so much more to say, but I will stop now, and let me reiterate that my door is always open to talk about masculinities and these issues with you. Thank you so much, Adam. It's been a pleasure as always. And this is clearly a call to make sure that this is the way to kick off the discussion on the topic. Time fled by, and there's so much more to discuss. So there's really a very good opportunity to think of having other dialogues about this with different organizations. So I'd like to give the floor to our coordinators from GENSAC and Peace in Our Cities, Farida and Valeria, so that they can actually close this seminar. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank our speakers, Magda, Catherine, Ariana, and Danielle, for their important work. And I would also like to thank Eleanor and Heather for making this possible, and to Maria, Corina, Natalia, and Veronica for their translation. And it's been a pleasure to have this first meeting with GENSAC and linking our goals of reducing gender violence and armed violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valeria, and thank you, Daniel, as well as our distinguished guests and panelists. We are really sorry that we don't have time for questions, but this panel was extremely educative, and we would love to continue engaging with you. And if you have some questions, or you are interested in collaborating with one of the panelists, don't hesitate to contact us either through GENSAC or Peace in Our City, and we will be happy to connect you. In the near future, we'll be publishing the report that Magda Coase has written, which clearly looks into the impact, the gendered impact of violence in urban settings. It's a topic that really concerns us all, and through our experts today, we had a chance to understand the massive work that is being conducted in various parts of Latin America, and we hope that in the future we will be able to extend this conversation to other regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa or the Balkans or other parts of the world. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. It is an honor to have hosted you today, and we look forward to continue this conversation. You all have a wonderful evening or day.